Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's good to be with you all. This morning we're going to be starting on a series that we're going to be running over the next few weeks. This series is called Covenant Relationships, and what we really want to do is we really want to establish an understanding of what it means to be in a covenant relationship, not only with God and with us with him, but also us with one another. That covenant relationships is more than just a friendship, it's more than just a word that we use on a Sunday, but actually this is something that is inherent in our Christian DNA and in our what it is to be a born-again Christian, what it is to be saved and to be part of a relationship with God. And so this morning we're really going to start to unpack what it means to be in a covenant. And as I say, over the next few weeks we're going to start to explore this a little bit more. If anyone wants to kind of beat the pastor, as it were, and not as in physically come up and beat the pastor, that wasn't what I meant, before anyone starts getting the baseball bat or anything like that. What I meant was if you wanted to get ahead of the pastor and do your homework beforehand. The series is based around one of the books that Pastors George and Hazel wrote called Covenant Relationships. I'm doing a plug for you, Dot. It's in the bookshop. You can purchase that. I would encourage you guys to read that. It's a wonderful addition to what we're going to be talking on over the next few weeks. But as I say, we really want to be unpacking what it means to be in a covenant and what it means to have this covenant relationship, us with God and also us with one another. And so really I wanted to start this morning by explaining a little bit about what a covenant is and the benefits of having a covenant. And I want you to make 3 points if you can this morning. If you can remember them, remember them. If you can't, write them down. If you haven't got any pen or paper, then steal someone's pen and write it on the neck of the person in front of you or something like that. But we want 3 points that we want to remember this morning about the benefit of being in a covenant. And these 3 things are that when we're in a covenant, firstly, it brings protection. Secondly, it brings purpose. And then thirdly, it brings power. So the first thing is that it brings protection, secondly purpose, and thirdly power. This is the benefit of us being in a covenant relationship. And a covenant, as I say, is far more than just an understanding of what it is to know one another. We can have friends. Hopefully we've all got at least one friend somewhere we can kind of go to. We can have friendships, but covenant relationships are far more than a friendship. Covenant relationship takes it to another level. You see, quite often with friendships and commitments that we make, it's based around a task-orientated thing. I will stand with you whilst we're doing this. Quite often we've had that we'll say, I'm with you for this thing. If we're doing something together, I'm with you and I'm doing it with you. A covenant relationship goes beyond that. It says, I'm with you regardless of the situation or the circumstance. I'm standing by your side and we're standing together. This covenant relationship goes beyond a purpose. It goes beyond a task. It moves into the very heart of I am for you regardless of what goes on, regardless of what happens. I am standing there to support and encourage and uplift you. And the greatest example of this covenant relationship that we can have is how God relates to us in this covenant relationship. He created a covenant with us, and we see this in the beginning of the Bible with Abraham, that God lays down a covenant, and all through the Old Testament we see different covenants that God makes with his people, Israel. And as he begins to talk to his people, and he begins to say, this is the covenant that I am making with you, he begins to identify these 3 things that we've spoken about. That as he makes a covenant with the people of Israel, firstly, it brings a protection to those people. No longer are they left to one side, but these are God's chosen people who come under the safety of his protection. They come under a banner of his protection. And so God makes this covenant with his people and he says, you are my chosen people. I will choose you and protect you from all the people around. And we see that through many circumstances through the Old Testament as the nation of Israel, whenever they honored God and put him in his right place, he honored that covenant to protect them and bring them through. And we see all through the Old Testament, there's times where the Israel army would go up against armies that were far bigger, far stronger, and far superior to them. And yet Israel would come out victorious because of the covenant relationship that God had with his people. And so what happens is, as he provides this protection for his people, he gives them a purpose. He says, you are my chosen people. And their purpose is to go and make people aware of who God is, to share that relationship one with another. And we see this all the way back to Noah in the Old Testament, that Noah was called to set an example for people around him. Everyone else was living a life that was not honoring God, that was not setting a good example. And God called to Noah and he said, I want you to build an ark, and then I want you to bring all the animals into the ark. He says, I will fill it with all the animals, and you and your family will go on board. Now what you've got to think is that Noah didn't just knock this ark up overnight. He didn't just sort of one night the neighbours went to bed and thought, Noah's making a bit of noise tonight, I wonder what he's doing. And they wake up the next morning, draw the curtains back and look through the windows that they haven't invented yet and see this ark and think, oh, hang on, Noah must be going for a bit of a jolly down the river. It was a long, arduous process of building this boat. If you imagine, he didn't have power saws, he didn't have cranes to lift the things up. This wasn't a small boat. It wasn't like a little row your boat gently down the stream kind of thing. This was a big boat. And Noah builds this and he spends the time building this. And all the time that he's building it, the people don't come up to him and go, you know what, Noah, you might be onto something here. Maybe we should listen to what God's saying to you. They start to mock him and say, Noah, you are an idiot. It doesn't even rain. Why are you building a boat? There's no water around here. What on earth is this boat going to be for? They start to mock him. They start to jeer him and sort of cause him to go. And then what happens is that one day, all of a sudden these animals rock up. Noah closes the door and then the rain begins to fall. And all the people around him begin to think, hang on a minute, maybe Noah was onto something. And what happens is Noah was given a purpose, he was given a task that would honour this covenant that God had made with his people. And as Noah closed that door and it began to rain, all of a sudden people saw the purpose and saw the fruit of what Noah had done. But for them it was too late. And you see, when God makes a covenant with people, it brings a purpose to our lives. And so often people around us don't see that purpose. What they see is people doing things that seem strange. Because to people outside of a covenant relationship with God, Christianity seems strange. To people outside of a covenant relationship with God, your lifestyle should seem strange. Does your lifestyle seem strange to the people around you? Because if it doesn't, we need to start looking at ourselves and not the people around us. Because our lifestyle should set an example of something different from what everybody else is seeing. Because what happens is when we enter into that covenant relationship, our Christian walk is a covenant relationship with God. And when we enter into that, he sets us aside for a purpose. And if we're not living out that purpose, we're not honouring the covenant that we made with Christ and with God when we came into that relationship with him. Noah looked like an idiot. Noah was building something that had no purpose until the moment that it was desperately needed. Sometimes you will be called to build something that has absolutely no purpose until the very moment that it is needed. And you will look like a fool, you will feel like an idiot, and you will say, God, why on earth am I doing this? But at that very moment when you finish the work, when you close the door, all of a sudden the purpose arrives. Set your life apart as something different, purposed by God to do what he's calling you to. Look like a fool and don't care. One of the verses that I love in the Bible is that David danced until his clothes fell off. Now, I don't like that because I like dancing naked. That's not what I do. I can promise you I don't like dancing at all. But I love the fact that David was willing to make himself a fool in front of people because he loved God so much. I can see people say, I honestly don't dance around naked. It's not something that I don't think I've ever done and don't intend to do. But it was something that David honoured God so much. He loved God so much. He was so enthusiastic about his relationship with God that he was willing to forsake what everybody else thought about him so that he could glorify and honour him. And I think as Christians, we should be doing the same, not dancing around naked. That's a cult. But we should, we should be honouring God by giving him absolutely everything that we can and saying, I am going to set my life aside as a purpose. I'm going to get in trouble this morning. Because if we don't have this relationship with God, if we don't say, I want a covenant relationship with you, we will never value the purpose that he has put on our life. If we don't see the value in the relationship, we'll never see the value in the calling. So often people don't see what they're worth because they don't understand the relationship that they have with God. Until you know how much God thinks about you and how much God loves you, you will never be able to appreciate what he's put on the inside of you. So God provides a protection in his covenant relationship, and then he provides a purpose. And the third thing is that he provides a power. And one of the examples that I love of this is the story of Joshua and the walls of Jericho. Because what most of you will know is that if people walk around a wall, it shouldn't fall down. If we all decided we were going to walk around this building, it's not going to move. It's going to stay exactly where it is. I really hope it is anyway. I don't. We better not try it just in case God decides to have a laugh. But there was no natural power in the people of Israel to be able to bring the walls of Jericho down. Walking around a wall is not enough power to bring it down. Even if a couple of the guys were sort of stood there kicking it as they walked around and just giving it a little nudge, even those guys weren't strong enough to bring the wall down. There was not the power in them. But when they understood the covenant that they had with God and obeyed what he was calling them to, the power came from God through them and the walls fell down. One of the things I love is that historians cannot find the ruins of Jericho, because not only was it destroyed, but the very foundations were destroyed as well. So there is nothing left of those walls. Most ancient civilizations, they can pinpoint where they are and say, this is this, this is that. But there is absolutely nothing left of the walls of Jericho, because when God's power moves through something, it obliterates anything that stands in its way. Every single thing that stands against you when you follow God's covenant and allow his power to move through you is obliterated to the point where it no longer remains, where there is no sign of anything being left. But it comes back to this covenant relationship of understanding who we are and who Christ is in us. And as I say, when you look at the Old Testament, you see this example of a chosen people entering into a covenant with Christ, but it was a conditional covenant. It was a covenant that said, as long as you honor me, as long as you put me first, this is the covenant that I make, that there will be protection, that there will be, what was the second one? Pop quiz. Purpose, thank you. And that finally there will be power. I'm glad you guys remember. This is the covenant that God made with them, that as long as you honor me, these three things will be part of our relationship. But we see throughout the Old Testament that when they walked away from God, when they forgot about who he was and the power that was in him, that they stepped out from under that covenant, they stepped out from under that blessing that God had given them. And then that brings us along to a point where Jesus comes onto the earth. In some cases, thousands of years after this covenant had been made originally. And as Jesus comes onto the earth, he uses a phrase that I absolutely love. Because one of the many things that gets debated in church these days is, do we need the Old Testament? Should we only have the New Testament or the Old Testament? Do we live only under the Old Covenant or the New Covenant? One of the phrases that I love that Jesus uses is in Matthew chapter 5. And he says, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. That word fulfillment means to bring to completion, to make whole, to fulfill, to put everything right and everything in place that needs to be there. So when Jesus came and he said, I came to fulfill the law, what it means is that up until that point it was an imperfect law. It was not complete. And when Jesus came, he completed those things. Now what I want you to imagine, does anyone remember the old acetate machines, the overhead projectors? We used to, this was my first job in church, was the acetate machines. And you'd sit there, and what would happen was if you wanted to be, most people would just change the sheet over, sing the song, and then change it to the next one. We decided we wanted to be the very best acetators that were out there. I don't think that's a verb, but we'll go with it. We wanted to be the very best acetators that were out there. So every verse, we'd move it up to the top of the screen, and then back down for the chorus, and then up to the next. And so we'd be sliding it around. And I remember one time we were doing worship here, and many of you will remember Andrew Fisher. He was the worship leader here for many, many years. He decided that we needed to sing a bridge to a song 14 times. So we'd sing this bridge, and then we'd slide it back down to the chorus, and it'd come back up to the bridge, and slide it back down to it, and now we're doing the bridge again. So 14 times we sang, and so we're there sliding this acetate machine backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. It's got absolutely nothing to do with my message, but I just wanted to share a story with you. But if you remember these acetates, they were see-through, and then you could print something on them or write something on them, or if you were really, really cheap, you would use like a plastic wallet instead of an acetate because you'd run out of acetates. But what you could do is you could draw something on it. But you could also overlap them. Because they were see-through, you could put something on top of another one. And you would be able to see both pictures, whatever was on the first one and then whatever was on the second one. And I believe that the covenant that God made in the Old Testament and the New Testament covenant works the same way. That it wasn't that the first one was done away with and got rid of, but it was incomplete, it was part of a picture. And then when Christ came, he completed it and put the second part of it in place. So it's like an overlap. See, quite often you will hear people say, we don't need the Old Testament anymore because it was Old Covenant and there's nothing in there that's any good for us. I don't agree with that. You can debate that with me after the service, that's fine. But I believe that one of the best explanations I ever heard for this was that the law, the Old Covenant, was like the mirror that showed us every way in which we didn't measure up. Every way in which there was dirt on our face. The grace of the new covenant was like the water that came and washed it away. The law provided the example of how we couldn't measure up, so that when Christ came and provided the grace, it showed us how much we needed him. So I want you to imagine that these acetates are like an overlap of the two covenants, that the first one was incomplete, imperfect, and that the second one was when Christ came, it filled the gaps. But one of the things I love is something Pastor George used to say. Some things died at the cross. Some things began at the cross. And some things continue through the cross. See, what happened is some of the things in the old covenant no longer applied once Christ had come. We read in Galatians chapter 3 that it says Christ became the curse for us, because it says in Deuteronomy that anyone who hangs on a tree is cursed. So he took on the curse of the law that we could have the blessing of it. See, the curse of the law no longer applies. It stopped at the cross because Christ made a better way through the cross for that to happen. Some things began at the cross. They weren't in existence until the Christ came and the new covenant happened. And then we could walk in this freedom of the new covenant. But some things carry on through the cross as well. It was not okay for people to murder one another before the cross. It's still not okay to murder. However much you dislike your neighbour, it's still not okay to murder them. You can't stand there and say, God's grace forgives me. That's not how it works. Some things carry on through the cross. These covenants weren't one in, one out. New one comes, the old one goes, but they overlap, they completed one another. And when Christ says, I came to complete the law, to fulfill it, what he was saying was, I came to make perfect an imperfect covenant with my people. You see, the covenant was conditional in the Old Testament, and it was limited to God's chosen people. Once Christ came, it became an unconditional covenant that if you enter into him, this is what's available to you. But not only was it available to his chosen people, but it was available to every single person. So even if you're not a Jew in here this morning, which I imagine most of us aren't, the covenant, the new covenant that God made with us is available to us today. And so what happens is, as we step into this new covenant, this new relationship with Christ, those three things that we started off with become available to us. That once we enter into a relationship with Christ, we gain his protection. We read all the way through the New Testament and all the way through the Old as well about how God protects his people, how God comes alongside and lifts his people up, surrounds them and protects them. We're given a purpose. If anyone doesn't know what that purpose is, it's in Matthew chapter 28. It says, go into the world and make disciples of every nation, teaching them. And that is the purpose that we are given. Every single one of us has been given a purpose. Now, when you go out from these doors and you start to tell people about Christ and you start to share the love of God with people, you might look like an idiot. You might seem strange because you're building something that other people don't see a need for until the moment that it comes to completion. You are telling people about something that is to come that at the moment they don't see. But the thing is, so many people out there need Christ now and not just when they die. Because there is a benefit to being in covenant relationship with God now, and it's not just a ticket to heaven. Quite often we see that as the evangelist's line is that you don't want to go to hell, so come to church and you'll experience hell and then go to heaven. No, I'm joking. So often we hear that preached that this is a way to eternal life, but it's more than that. This is a way to enter in to a covenant with God. This is a way to benefit from all these things that are available to you right now. And if we don't preach that to the people around us, they'll never see a need for it because eternity seems so far away. It's not until the very moment where they need it that they wish they'd heard more. They wish someone had spoke to me and said, this is what it's all about. Every single one of us should be in a relationship with Christ that sets us apart for a purpose. But our purpose is to share that relationship with the people around us, to show people that there is a better way to life than just going by day to day, just trying to accumulate everything that you can. There's a better way, and it starts with what Christ did for us. And then that third thing is that we have to understand that when we come into a relationship with Christ, it gives us a power to move in ways that we've never seen before. And I believe that one of the biggest problems with the church today is that it doesn't seem to understand the power that was available to it. It seems to operate as though there's nothing behind it. And I'm not talking about this church or church in Rugeley. I'm talking about the church in general. Needs to come back to an understanding of the power that flows from God through us for the world around us. I love reading through the book of Acts because it was people who understood what the power of God could do and weren't afraid to put it into action. It was people who were willing to say, this is what my God can do, and then demonstrated it to the world around them. In the book of Acts chapter 3, you see that Peter and John are going just to pray. They're going to the temple, something that they did every day. And that when they met someone who was lame on the way there, they didn't go, I'm ever so sorry that you're in this situation. Here's £5. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? That's not a wrong thing to do. If you see someone in the street, it's not a wrong thing to buy them a cup of coffee. But how many of us have the same mentality of Peter and John, where they said, I don't have any money on me. We've given all our money away. But what I do have is the power of Christ living in me. So get up and walk because he can heal you. So often that's the last thing that we think of rather than the first thing. And I think if we truly understood the power of Christ that lived on the inside of us, we would step out more. We would reach out to the community more. And we would encourage the people around us. And we would demonstrate the love of God through the power that flows through us. And what I love about the book of Acts is that people swarmed to Christianity. It says that numbers were added to them daily, that the church was multiplied daily, because they saw something that they didn't have and knew that they needed it. Just like with Noah, they didn't realize until the moment that it happened that they needed that boat. A clever neighbor would have thought, Noah might be onto something. I better build my own boat. And even if it were a nice little rowing boat or something that he could have gone alongside, but he didn't realize the purpose of it until it was too late. And if we don't demonstrate the love of God and the power of Christ in us, people won't realize that they need it until it's too late. Each one of us has a purpose, and that purpose is to honor the covenant that we made with God and that God made with us when his son died on a cross for us, so that we could go around and share with one another and with the people around us the power of God and the purpose that he calls us to. But I think that too often we want to make ourselves fit in rather than make ourselves stand out. And what happens when we nullify the purpose of God is we remove the power of God. If we nullify what God's called us to and stop doing the things that he's called us to because we want to fit in, then we don't create an avenue for God's power to flow through us. When we set ourselves apart, that's only when we can truly see the power of God working through us. The people of Israel, when they walked around Jericho, would have felt like idiots. And every single one of them would have said, what on earth are we doing here? Walking around, what difference is this going to make? Until the moment that the power of God moved through them and the walls began to break. And I would have loved to have been there and heard the noise that they lifted up, because they had to step out in faith first. And I imagine that as they walked around that seventh time and then lifted up a cheer, I believe they would have given it everything they got. And there'd have been this split second of what if it doesn't work? But then they see the crack begin to form down the wall. And they see the top begin to fall off. And all of a sudden that cheer of, I'm doing this because God's called me to, but I don't know whether it's going to happen, becomes a cheer of, God can do this. And I fully believe it. And I'm going to cheer all the harder and all the louder. And I'm going to raise my voice as much as I possibly can, because I know that the power of God can flow through me. But it took a step of faith first, knowing that they were following the purpose of God, to step out and say, if God's called us to this, we'll do it. And then when the power begins to flow through them, then they know that there's nothing that God can't do. And I believe for people in here today, there's a point where God has called you to a purpose, but it takes a step of faith before we'll see the power flow through us. It takes that stepping out and knowing that if God's behind me, I'll see the thing come to pass that he's calling me to. And so what I really want to challenge you guys with this morning is, does this relationship that you have with God, does it honor and resemble a covenant relationship? Do you see God's protection in your life? Do you see God's purpose, and do you see God's power flowing through you? And if you're not seeing these things, then we need to ask ourselves, am I honoring God's covenant by saying, regardless of the situation, God, I'm for you? Or have we brought it down to more of a friendship or an acquaintance of saying, God, if you want me to do something, I'll do it for you. God, if this is what you're calling me to do, then I'll get this task done. We come task-orientated rather than relationship-orientated. And I really want to challenge you all to bring your focus back to relationship with God, that honouring that covenant relationship of saying, this is who my God is. This is who Christ is that died for me, and this is the power that flows through me when God is working and doing all that he's called me to do. And I truly believe that as the church sees that, it will begin to see things the way that God sees things. Because when God brings us into relationship with him, he brings us into alignment with how he sees the things around us. And no longer do we look at things the way that we would imagine things should be, but we begin to look at things the way that Christ sees things.